You know, when we first learn about international trade, we often picture this really simple game of supply and demand. But the reality? It's much more like a high-stakes chess match, where governments and massive companies are using a whole playbook of strategic moves just to get an edge. And today, we're going to break down that playbook.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to understand the playing field itself. Then, we'll get into the key moves. We're talking tariffs, quotas, and the super aggressive tactic of dumping. We'll also look at how countries try to protect their own up-and-coming champions before we get to the final takeaway.
Okay, first things first. Most of the simple models of free trade you see, they assume what's called perfect competition. Lots of buyers, lots of sellers. But what happens when the game is dominated by just one powerful player? A monopoly. And that question, it changes everything. See, when a single company has that kind of market power, the potential for huge profits is just sitting there. And that's where something called strategic trade policy comes into play. It's basically government stepping in and trying to tip the scales to shift those profits toward their own companies. So how do they do it? What are their weapons of choice? Well, let's look at two of the most common tools in the government's playbook, tariffs and quotas. Now, they might sound kind of similar, but trust me, when you're up against a monopoly, their effects are worlds apart.
So let's get the basic difference down. A tariff? That's just a tax. It's simple. You make imported stuff more expensive, which limits things based on price. A quota, though, that's a whole different beast. It's a hard cap, a physical limit on how much can come in, period. It limits the actual quantity.
And this, right here, is where it gets really interesting. With a tariff, the home monopoly still has to compete. If it jacks up its prices too much, people will just buy the imported goods, even with the tax. But a quota? That's like building a wall. Once that import limit is hit, that's it. The home company is the only game in town. It creates this sheltered market where its monopoly power can run wild.
So let's follow the money here. Who wins and who loses? What's so fascinating is that even with a tariff, which is supposed to be the less harmful option, the country as a whole still takes a hit. Just look at consumer surplus. That's a huge loss for you, the buyer. Yeah, the local producer and the government gain a little, but it's not enough to make up for it. That bottom line, net home welfare, is what economists call deadweight loss. It's economic value that just vanishes. It's gone. So, the takeaway here is crystal clear. Because a quota completely shields that domestic company from any real competition, it gives them the power to crank up prices. This is exactly why organizations like the World Trade Organization really push countries to use tariffs instead of quotas. If you absolutely have to pick one, the tariff is seen as the lesser of two evils, especially for consumers.
Okay, so far we've been talking about government policies. But what about the strategies used by the companies themselves? Well, that brings us to a really aggressive and pretty controversial tactic called dumping. It's basically designed to conquer foreign markets.
Now I know what you're thinking. That makes zero sense, right? Selling at a loss sounds like a one-way ticket to bankruptcy. But, as we're about to see, when a company has a monopoly in its own backyard, this seemingly crazy move can actually be incredibly profitable.
So here's the official definition. Dumping is basically price discrimination on a global scale. A company uses its safe, high-profit home market as a launchpad to invade a foreign market with prices that are just artificially low.
Let's make this real with some super simple math. So, imagine a company sells 10 gizmos at home for 25 bucks each. Their average cost to make one is 20 bucks. Easy peasy, they make a nice clean profit of $50. Now, watch this. The same company makes 10 times more gizmos, but they dump them in another country for only $15 each. That's $5 below their average cost. You'd think they're losing money, right? But look at the total profit. It just doubled to $100. How on earth is that possible?
And here is the secret sauce. It all comes down to something called marginal cost. See, the company's big fixed costs, like the factory and all the machines, those are already paid for by the sales back home. The actual cost to produce just one more gizmo is super low, maybe only 10 bucks. So as long as that export price of $15 is higher than the $10 marginal cost, every single unit they sell abroad is pure extra profit. So, if dumping is the offensive attack, what's the defensive move? How does a country protect itself, especially when it's trying to build a new industry from the ground up? Well, that brings us to a classic defensive strategy, infant industry protection.
The idea here is actually pretty intuitive. A brand new industry is kind of like a seedling. It just can't compete with these giant established trees right away. So the argument goes that these infant industries need a temporary shield from cheaper imports to give them some time to grow, to learn, and to get efficient enough to stand on their own 2 feet.
In theory, it's supposed to work like a set of training wheels. You start with a temporary tariff, which protects the new company and gives it breathing room to learn and get better. Over time, its costs should come down, and then, once it's strong enough, you take off the training wheels, you remove the tariff, and the now mature company can go compete with the big dogs on the world stage.
Okay, so we've looked at tariffs, quotas, dumping, protectionism, all these different plays that governments and companies use to get an advantage. So what's the big picture here? What does it all add up to?
Here are the key lessons we can pull from the playbook. First, when you have powerful monopolies in the mix, free trade gets really complicated really fast. We've seen how quotas are way worse for consumers than tariffs because they supercharge a monopoly's power. We've learned that dumping isn't crazy. It's a calculated strategy that cleverly splits fixed and marginal costs. And finally, protecting a new industry is basically the government making a big bet on the future.
And all of this leaves us with one final big question to chew on. When you look at all these strategies, are the rules of global trade really designed for fair play? Or are they just a way for some teams to get a permanent home field advantage? I guess the answer really depends on which side of the field you're on.